This lesson on the foundations of early Rome is about the conflict of the orders that we'll look at in a moment. First off, here's the quiz on the previous bunch of lessons. Just as a recap really, what did Romulus create? What did Numa add? What did Hostilius add? What did Ancus add? And what is the narrative point of the Etruscan kings? It's all a story. What's the point of the story? What purpose do the Etruscan kings serve in the narrative of early Rome? So, we're doing the conflict of the orders. Recall what the title refers to and the issues of its historicity. How true is this? Plebeian, patrician, agriculture, farming, anachronistic, wrong time, ownership, subsistence, just enough, Punic Wars and Hannibal. So, what was the conflict of the orders? Well, it's a series of conflicts, fights, between the patricians and the plebeians in early history of the Roman Republic. We're going to look at the period about 50 years between 494 and 440 BC and how this really affected Rome and its political structures, because essentially the plebeians win the conflict of the orders. So why is it a big deal? Because it's the first recorded series of strikes in history. Yeah, I've said to you before in class, you've got to remember, a couple of 100 years ago, even 100 years ago in our country, there weren't that many books. Every educated person who'd been to a decent school had read Livy. So they knew, they were familiar with these stories, including early Marxists and revolutionaries and all sorts of people. So they knew that in the dim, dark pasts of Rome, the ordinary people, through methods we're going to look at in this lesson and other lessons, had managed to win greater political freedom. They'd had essentially what we would call strikes, and they had won. Now, what are these stories really describing? Because they're not describing history. They're describing a series of conflicts brought about by poverty, the plebeians, that are sort of wrong time, wrong place. What it looks like happening is that at the end of the wars with Hannibal, hundreds of years later, the ordinary Romans, the plebeians, were suffering great poverty, having had 20 odd years of warfare, and were extremely unhappy with the way they were being treated, that the patricians, the rich, had too much power and too much land. And there was a series of conflicts. Then these are the Gracchi, the Gracchus brothers. They were tribunes at the time, and they tried to get land taken off patricians and given to plebeians, and caused a big ruckus. Now, it looks like a lot of the records were lost from early Rome, and so Livy is just using stuff he knew had happened quite recently and moved it in some way and added to stories that already existed, legendary stories, to make up the conflict of the order. So it's anachronistic. Now, what causes this conflict? Well, the plebeians are unhappy. They are poor, they are struggling. Why are they struggling? Well, warfare. They've been the bulk of the Roman army through the wars of independence. When the wars are over, they are poor. They've had to borrow money to survive from patricians. They can't pay it back. Therefore, the patricians take their land, sell them into slavery, and they are extremely unhappy about all this. They see it as being very unfair because they're the bulk of the Roman army. They're the legionaries. And lastly, this first lesson, what form did this conflict take? Because it's not a revolution. It's a series of what we would today call strikes. The plebeians leave Rome. They set up a camp nearby, and they refuse to do any work, and they refuse to fight in the army, thereby forcing the patricians to give in to their demands. And we'll look at that in more detail in future lessons.